I have nowhere to go, no hope. What should I do? In this video, we're going to see what happened in a couple of cases in Jesus' life and how he brought hope to people in his day. I'm Pastor Mike, and this is the platform presentation of Sonrise Fellowship from last Sunday. Here at Sonrise, we believe Scripture makes a difference in our lives and that it can make a difference in your lives as well. If you're new here, I hope you'll click the subscribe button and learn more about the channel by reading the description below. In Matthew's story about the ruler's daughter and her passing away, we see what to do when we're cut off from hope. I call the message "Plugged Drains." And if you listen to the end, somewhere in this story, there's hope for the despair we face today.
Well, this is week number 5. This is the final week in this series. The series is called The Unexpected Ramifications of the King's Authority. You think after 5 weeks I could say that a little smoother, but we've looked at several unexpected ramifications of the way this king uses his authority, haven't we? We've seen in the first week how he overcomes incapacity. And there is not an incapacity that we might suffer that is sufficient in the face of his authority. We saw how he healed a centurion's servant, he healed a leper, and he even healed Peter's mother-in-law. You guys have no idea what a struggle it was to not make that message a message on how to treat your mother-in-law. It was kind of a challenge for me. The second week, we saw how when Jesus isn't worrying, we shouldn't either. He's calmed the storm that he almost slept through on the Sea of Galilee. And then the next time we were together, we talked about how he reacts to resistance to his ministry differently depending on who it is that's doing the resisting. And he didn't let the demons stop him at all. He just cast them into the pigs and they ran down into the lake and drowned. But when the villagers resisted him, he got back in the boat and went back home. The last week, we saw the calling of Matthew and how that was a new type of servant in his kingdom, and how that means if we're going to be in his kingdom, we're probably going to have a new type of friend. Now this week, I think I got a very creative title for the message this week. This week's message is called Plugged Drains. And I am going to look at the concept of opening up the channel of hope. Now, you all know what a plugged drain is, right? It's that trap underneath the sink that gets hair or grease or something else in it that stops the water up. And if you don't get on it pretty quick, you're going to have some pretty stinky stuff sitting in your sink. And if you happen to miss that stage, you're going to have a mess all over the place. I actually experienced that this week. We were doing some maintenance on the well, and I had to flush out the pipes, and I wasn't paying attention, and there was a drain behind the ice machine that I didn't know about, and I mopped up an entire mop bucket of water. I really filled the whole mop bucket up, mopping that up, because I wasn't paying attention to what was happening. Makes for a lot of work if you don't stay on top of these plugged up pipes. And that, ultimately, is what Drano is for, right? You pour Drano down in the pipe, it eats up that clog, it washes away. Unfortunately, Drano doesn't work on everything that stops up. It only basically works on water. What happens to other things that have to flow when they get plugged up? Things like hope. Now, in our culture, there are a lot of places where people look for hope. When you get to looking for hope in this culture, and you're talking to somebody who feels hopeless, and they're looking for that positive outcome in life somewhere, many of them will look to the economy. And as long as I've got a savings account that's earning interest, and an investment that's earning dividends, and I've got a secure retirement account, then I've got hope for the future. Except for those of us, I'm not one of them, but those people who can remember the 1929 crash. Or I think it was in 1985, what they call Black and Blue Monday, when all of the stocks lost about half of their value. Or 2008, when the value of the whole world dropped by a third. the economy isn't a very good place to look for hope, is it? So some people look to politics, especially in a year like this when we got a presidential election going on, and we assume that if we can get the right party in office, we've got a positive future. Folks, when has that worked in the world history? That politicians will tell you anything. They're doing the best they can to get you to pin your hopes on them. And then most people complain, business as usual. The Democrats fighting the Republicans, the liberals fighting the conservatives. There's not much hope in that. So some people will, especially younger people, will look towards social media. I'm feeling bad about myself today. I'll post a picture and see what happens. And if I get 100,000 likes, then I must be in pretty good shape. But if I don't get any likes, then I'm depressed even more. And we tend to criticize some people for their social media involvement. But you know, media goes back a lot further than Facebook. The news isn't a very good place to look for hope either, is it? I know some people, now I'm just going to say this, and you guys can throw tomatoes if you want to, but there are some Christians that read the newspaper more than they read their Bible. And as long as there's good news in the newspaper, they think they've got a hopeful future. Problem is, recently there isn't that much good news in the newspaper. And so we get a little bit depressed. It doesn't matter whether it's social media or the news media, it's all designed to keep you coming back. You don't hear very many stories in the news media about man bites dog anymore, because that type of thing doesn't keep people coming back. But man blows up a city, you're set for the week, aren't you? So there's not much hope in the media. If you're my age, most people in this room are either older or younger than me. I fall in between the baby boomers and the baby busters. But I can remember in school being taught, actively taught, intentionally taught, to pin my hopes on secular philosophy. We may not know how to solve it yet, but science will find a way. Or go to school, do well in school, go to college, get a good job, and then you'll be able to buy anything you want, and you'll be happy. And you'll be secure. And you'll have hope. The secular philosophy doesn't work. And when all five of these fall apart, then in our United States culture, many people will turn to false religions. Now, currently, this changes every couple of years, but currently the way this is actually manifesting itself is you'll run into people that say, I don't adhere to any organized religion, I'm spiritual. Okay. All right? I'm just going to poke a hole in that one right now and let that balloon fly away. All right? If you can pick and choose from Christianity and Hindu and New Age and all this and throw it together and create your customized religion, which, by the way, is always false. Personal opinion, personal statement. But if you can do that, then I get to do that. Now we've got two religions. Therefore, one of them is wrong. They can't both be right. How do you know it's yours? There's no hope in that. There's just denying reality. And as I look at these 6 sources of hope that your friends and my friends are pinning their future on, I begin to realize that they're all basically blocked drains compared to the real source of hope that we hear about today in the passage that Jared just read for us. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 9. If you want to follow along, I'm going to go through this real quickly, but in Matthew chapter 9, Jesus has just called Matthew. Matthew has thrown a party, and several people interrupted that party. The Pharisees tried to criticize Jesus for eating too much. The disciples of John the Baptist the Pharisees criticized Jesus for partying with the wrong people. It was the disciples of John the Baptist who criticized him for eating too much. And then suddenly, this other fella comes in. And Matthew calls him a ruler. And Matthew assumes that since the people he's writing to are mostly Jews, that they would recognize that term ruler as a synagogue ruler. Think of the ruler of a synagogue, kind of like the executive pastor of a church. He doesn't do much of the teaching or preaching, but he organizes everything behind the scenes. He's an important person in the community and a religious figure in the community. Suddenly, he busts into Matthew's house, a tax collector's house, which would disqualify him from doing his job. And he says to Jesus, "My daughter has just died." And if you're following my advice and studying the Bible and you're cross-referencing to the other Gospels, Mark and Luke both talk about this event, and they both say that when he came in, he says, "My daughter is ill." He hadn't died yet, but Matthew is writing to Jews who may have actually heard this story, so he's kind of condensing it a little bit. He's coming to the conclusion for them. It's also raising their anticipation just a little bit. When you look at the crowd that would have been hearing this and seeing this, we might think that that would be a disaster. Just a horrible thing for a child to die. But I did a little research. I found out that in the first century Roman Empire, the infant mortality rate was between 28 and 30%. That means almost 1 in every 3 children born in the Holy Land died. It would have been very frequent that they would have heard about a child dying. So they might have clucked their lips a little bit and hung their head and, "Oh, that's a shame, somebody's lost another child," but it wouldn't have been earth-shattering to them. Until we cross-reference to the other Gospels again and find out that this child was 12 years old. She was nearly an adult. And by that point, if you understand how mortality rates work, she had a life expectancy of over 35. And so this was probably a pretty good shock to this synagogue ruler, that his daughter has suddenly taken ill and is about to die. So he comes into Matthew's house, takes the risk of being ostracized from his career, and makes a very public plea. He comes up to Jesus and bows down and says to Jesus, "I've got a problem." And you can almost hear the urgency in his voice. And that urgency has turned to enough humility that he can, in front of even these tax collectors and sinners, bow before Jesus and say, "My daughter has died. But if you will come and touch her, she will live." It's interesting to me that Matthew doesn't quote Jesus' response to that. He simply portrays him as getting up and going. And we see here Jesus in his authority responding to this man's humility with his own presence. And that prayer, if you will, brought Jesus close to him and his family. Unfortunately, they weren't able to just get up and walk straight to the man's house. They were interrupted on the way by a woman's stealthy touch. This gal had a discharge. And if you remember when Jared read that, it's a discharge of blood. And this is a very specific condition that women sometimes get. And it's spoken about in the Old Testament. And it basically outcasts a woman. Several things about this would have made her life unpleasant. First, if you lose blood for that long, and Matthew comes right out and tells us it was 12 years. Did anybody else notice the daughter was 12 years old and this woman's been sick for 12 years? I don't know what it is, but there's a connection there somewhere. But for 12 years, she's had this discharge, and just the lack of blood components, the low hemoglobin and things, and the lack of oxygen that would carry to her cells would just make her feel miserable most of the time. But not only that, spiritually, she was ostracized because the Old Testament law said she wasn't qualified to go into the place where religious things were happening. Socially, then, she would not be able to have friends and relatives around very much because they would also be considered unclean for those spiritual gatherings. So this has been a major thing for her. She's had this for 12 years and she hasn't been able to be cured. But she chooses a little different technique than the synagogue ruler used. She didn't go up and humbly request. She snuck up behind him. And she said to herself, if I just touch the hem of his garment, I'll be healed. Do you ever wonder why it was the hem of the garment? Remember that Moses told the Jewish men to put a fringe around the bottom of their garment to remind them that they were to follow the law, and it became a symbol for a holy person, or a person that was at least attempting to be right before God. And this woman, who was not acceptable in God's presence, comes up and touches the symbol of Jesus' rightness, and she gets results. Immediately, Jesus turns around, looks her right in the eye, and I can just see her face. Absolutely terrified. I thought I was going to get away with this. Now he's going to yell at me. He's going to criticize me. He's going to tell me what a bad person I am. No. He looks at her and says, your faith has made you well. He goes so far as to call her daughter, a very tender and intimate title. You see, this woman was desperate. She was at the end of her rope. And when Jesus became involved, he healed her. Well, the story continues, and Jesus gets to the ruler's house, and there's a funeral in process, an unscheduled, unexpected death in the family, and the commotion is going on. You ever wonder why that word was used? That's actually a technical term for a professional mourner. The flute players and the women who were really loud would come and they would scream at the top of their lungs. They would mourn as loud as they could. It was a display of love for the person lost, but they got paid good for their display of emotion. They were also considered experts in death. If they declared you dead, it was like in our culture, the coroner coming and saying, yep, he's beyond help, he's dead, do the paperwork. And when Jesus sees them, he tries to eject them from the scene. He says, go away, she's not dead, she's only asleep. Now, not dead would have raised their eyebrows. I said, what do you know? You're just a rabbi. We deal with this stuff every day. We know a dead person when we see it. And what do you mean sleeping? Well, they wouldn't have had too much trouble with that because it was kind of a common euphemism. It was for a really bad issue that wasn't permanent. He was saying to them, we're going to fix this. And they laughed at him. So Jesus went in and touched her, and she sat up. An actual resurrection. Now, there were several other resurrections that Jesus was involved in. If you read between the lines, resurrections for Jesus may have been a common thing, like an everyday part of his job. But when he gets involved, it doesn't matter what the disaster is. Miracles are a possibility. And he did a miracle here for this man and his family. Now, let's take all of this and put it together and see if we can come up with a principle, something that we can apply to our lives. And I would suggest that when despair clogs your hope, faith opens the way. Faith removes the clog. If you look at how this happened in the story, the ruler took the direct approach. He made a direct request. His faith motivated him to humbly ask for help. But the woman, she wasn't quite as direct, but she did still take a faith-filled risk. Before she touched Jesus, she said to herself, if I just touch his garment, I will be healed. Not only did she say it, she acted on it. What movie was it recently? The God's Not Dead, where the premise basically was any faith that doesn't take a risk is no faith at all. But now with the child, there's a little different issue here. They get there, they're already starting the funeral. You ever notice that Jesus never preached a funeral? When you raise the dead, the funeral's over. Okay? Put some funeral directors out of business, but hey, we like that idea, right? But when this child, she was already gone when Jesus got there. And Jesus performed an unexpected divine action. A miracle. Now, the application of this today is that faith works like Drano on despair. Despair is always a clog in the system, a blockage in the channel for hope. And faith removes the clog. But we have to understand what faith is. Faith is trusting Jesus to do something, even when we don't know what that something is. Faith is looking to the King and saying, you have authority. Faith is looking to the King and saying, you have power. Help me. And sometimes getting something other than what we expected. In some cases, it's exactly what we asked for, like the synagogue ruler. In some cases, it's subtly different, like the woman who thought she was just going to touch and leave, and all of a sudden she's better and she doesn't have any paperwork to do. In some cases, it's, I don't know what to ask for, God. There's been a disaster. And He directly intervenes. So in Matthew chapter 28, Jesus tells His disciples after His resurrection, all authority in heaven on earth has been given to me. All. There's nothing restricted from His authority. That means He is supervising heaven and a number of angels that we can't even fathom. He's supervising earth, not just earth now, but manipulating earth from the past to get to earth to the future. He's got a bigger vision than what we have. He's got a broader perspective. And sometimes He's going to look at our requests and say, no. And faith is willing to accept that even when it's not what we expected. Because faith is trusting Jesus to do what's right, even though we may not know what that is. So I'm cautioning you at this point, be a little bit careful, because there are a lot of teachers out there that are not teaching that. I want you to remember and take away with you today that faith doesn't promise an end to the issue. Faith may bring an end to the issue. Faith may change the issue. Faith may not change the issue at all. But faith does promise an open line to hope. Because we're depending on the character of Jesus and not what He can give us like a slot machine. If we remember that Jesus is using His ultimate authority over heaven and earth, then whatever we take to Him, we can be hopeful about. Because this is the King that not only is trustworthy, He's demonstrated that trustworthiness when He went to the cross, promising to rise again, which would have got any of us locked in an institution. But He did it. And now, we may not understand it, but we have hope for the future.
Well, that was the message that I called Plugged Drains that was delivered last Sunday morning at Sonrise Fellowship. I hope this was helpful. I hope you find a way to unplug the channel of hope in your life. If you did and you think this material is helpful, I hope you'll subscribe. Click the bell down at the bottom so that you can get notified when new material is let out. And any comments you can leave would be helpful. Questions I'll try to answer, suggestions on how to tweak my presentations, ways that I can change the presentation to make it more useful to your friends. And finally, if you live anywhere near Enid, Oklahoma, I hope you will come to visit us. Our services are at 10 o'clock on Sunday morning, and the address is on our Facebook page. Until then, I hope you find hope to get you through this week and every week to come.